Good morning, bon dia. My name is Devin Gramman. I'm an assistant professor of Spanish sociolinguistics at the University of Oregon in the United States. Today's talk is part of a series, Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online, an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussions on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Anna Babel. Dr. Babel is an associate professor in the Hispanic Linguistics program in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at The Ohio State University. She holds a PhD in linguistics and in anthropology from the University of Michigan. Dr. Babel's research examines the relationship between language and social categories, particularly in settings characterized by language contact. Her most recent work considers how we become aware of different ways of speaking, and conversely, how our knowledge and beliefs about language influence the way that we speak. She's best known for her ethnographic research on Spanish and Quechua contact in central Bolivia, which is the setting for her 2018 ethnography between the Andes and the Amazon. Dr. Babel's research has done much to advance our understanding of the nature of sociolinguistic awareness and control, as well as social motivations for language contact phenomena. She has published articles on these topics in a number of leading journals, including the Journal of Language Contact, the Journal of Sociolinguistics, Language and Society, and the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology. She has edited the 2016 volume, Awareness and Control in Sociolinguistic Research, and this has become required reading for many graduate students pursuing research in sociolinguistics. More recently, Dr. Babel co-edited the volume Contact, Structure, and Change, which was just published this spring and is now available online via open access and in print. Dr. Babel and other contributing authors of this exciting new volume address the classic question of how and why languages change over time, both through the lens of the study of language contact and through the lens of the study of Indigenous American languages. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Anna Babel, whose talk is titled, "What do we mean by awareness? A sociolinguistic perspective." I kindly remind you all that questions can be asked in the chat.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for being here, especially for those of you who may be in earlier time zones, as I know Devin is. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and start my slideshow. Thank you, Devin, for the introduction. I cannot see, as you may know, questions in the chat, so we're going to hold off on the questions until we get to the end. And if you see me looking off to the side, that's where I have my notes. So yeah, this morning's question, what do we mean by awareness, a sociolinguistic perspective? Thank you for the introduction. I think you covered everything, but as Devin was saying, I do study sociolinguistics, language contact, linguistic anthropology, Andean Spanish, and I'm really interested in this border between linguistic structure and the cultural systems of meaning and value. So I work primarily in Bolivia, but especially in my more recent work, I've been branching out to contexts of migration, especially migration from Latin America to Spain and to the US, which I think is a really interesting context to look at awareness and how awareness can change over time and with different life experiences. I do have a wonderful community here at The Ohio State University with lots of people who work on the Andes and sociolinguistics and some great interlocutors across the university. So much of what you'll see today has been informed by those conversations and those relationships. I do believe that the professional is personal and the personal is political, to borrow a page from second wave feminism. And so when I work, I don't think of myself as working only on language or theory or language structure. I work with people and I have personal relationships with people. I'm deeply invested in human relationships and in human rights. So I practice a kind of anthropology that is explicitly engaged and a type of linguistics that is also explicitly engaged with issues of human rights. And I think this is especially important to mention today in the context of the pandemic, in the context of increased awareness of racial justice. I was originally asked to do this talk last fall, and unfortunately wasn't able to do it because of the circumstances of the pandemic, which meant that I, like many other parents, was dealing with increased childcare responsibilities, as well as the general trauma that was going on all around me. And so for those of you who are struggling with losses and differences in your life, and especially to those of you who are struggling with the events of the pandemic, my thoughts are with you, and we are all together in this experience. So on to theory. Where does social meaning reside? And I thought I'd start with this familiar sketch from Saussure, looking at the speaker-listener relationship. And I think that it's important to see here that there are two little heads, and this is something that I'll be returning to a couple of times in the talk. We have a speaker and a listener, and social meaning kind of happens in the little arrows between them. So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about 3 studies that I have done. All of these 3 studies are published, and then I'm going to take a little leap of faith towards what I've been thinking about recently. The studies that I'm going to talk about have 3 main points. The first one is about levels of awareness. So the idea is that we have levels of awareness that diverge at conscious or unconscious levels. Not sure levels is the right metaphor, but we can use it for now. And we can hold multiple approximately simultaneous impressions of a sign. The second study will look at the way that our unconscious biases or understandings of patterns in the world can insert, skew, or change bits of information to make them congruent with the way that we think the world should work. And the final study will argue that production may actually not always be the best sign of control. So to answer the question that I started out with, I love answering questions in the first couple of slides. When we say awareness, we're actually talking about a lot of different things. And in general, as an umbrella, I think of awareness as being an awareness of the links between language and social categories. So this can cover some different types of things. For one thing, it can mean the ability to recognize socially linked variation in language. It can mean the ability to identify or talk about socially linked variants. Sometimes we call these dialects or accents of language, and scholars might refer to this as metalinguistic commentary. It can mean the ability to shift between different styles of speech over different contexts, which we often refer to as control. Or it can mean the ability to recognize appropriateness to context or lack thereof, and position oneself accordingly. So if we flash back to 2016, when I and a group of wonderful collaborators published this volume, Awareness and Control in Sociolinguistic Research, we called this question an elephant in the room, by which I mean something that is obviously an issue, but nobody really talks about. Because when I went to conferences, I would hear people talking about linguistic variables and saying people are aware of this or people aren't aware of this, or there is some awareness, but there was no real precision and no real systematicity to the way that people were measuring awareness, or actually what they meant by awareness. It could have been any one of the things in the list in the previous slide. So some of the topics that we picked out in the volume as being important and needing further study included this question of levels or scales of awareness, the acquisition of awareness and control. How do we learn this stuff? Whether there might be cross-linguistic or cross-cultural variation in awareness or its close cousin salience. How we might cognitively model awareness. What is the role of agency and intentionality in awareness and control? And finally, what are the links between perception and production? And I want to be real specific. We have not answered any of these questions, but we have had some really good research on them in the past several years. And I think it's a really promising direction in general. So in the volume, we were drawing on a set of literature that included centrally the work of Michael Silverstein, looking at the ways that awareness is embedded both in grammar and in consciousness, the work of Dennis Preston, looking at different scales or dimensions of awareness, and the work of William Labov with the classic trichotomy of stereotypes, markers, and the third one, indicators. But there's also a lot of work in laboratory phonetics or in sociophonetics looking at how social categories are incorporated into language. And many of the researchers who worked on this volume also reached towards work in psychology and allied disciplines as they thought about the cognitive processes that underline awareness. And I refer specifically here to my colleague, Catherine Campbell-Kibler's work. She's continued to think and publish about this topic. So again, taking this back to classic linguistic theory, maybe Chomsky's most famous little citation from his 1965 seminal work, linguistic theory is concerned with an ideal speaker listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows its language perfectly and is unaffected by errors in applying his knowledge of the language in actual performance. This little snippet has been widely critiqued. Sociolinguists tend to object to a lot of it. Notice that Chomsky does not deny that sociolinguistic variation exists. Chomsky's position is that we can ignore it while we work out the cognitive underpinnings of language. Sociolinguists, beginning with Labov and continuing since then, tend to think that we cannot ignore sociolinguistic variation, that it is in fact a very deeply rooted and fundamental part of grammar. But what I wanted to point out here is the speaker-listener part. And again, this is going back to Saussure and our little two heads with the arrows in between them. And I just wanted to point out that also for Chomsky, we're not just talking about a speaker or a producer of language, we're talking about a relationship between speaker and listener. I think one difference between Chomsky and some other scholars is that Chomsky tends to think of the speaker and listener as being a single cognitive system within an individual person. When we look at other scholars, for example, Jane Hill equates this ideal native speaker to a monologic voice. So putting the locus of combinants in the monologic voice is using the systemic side of language as a resource for the practice of dominance, a unidirectional voice. But Hill argues that we should look at the central translinguistic domain, the context-bound, shifting, responsive, intertextual, centrifugal production of meaning in language, which is found prototypically in negotiations of dialogue on equal terms. And so I think this is a really interesting way of bringing back the dialogical, interactional kind of Bakhtinian approach to awareness and to communication, and remembering that it's always happening in interaction and between two speakers or a group of speakers, not just one speaking subject. When we think about linking perception and production, we have two speaker listeners who are each speaking and listening, who are each perceiving and producing. And Catherine Campbell-Kibler says that a speaker's ability to construct any given personal style, stance, or situational feature is constrained by two factors: the speaker's sociolinguistic facility with the semiotic systems in question, and also the willingness of their interlocutors at any cognitive level to interpret the performance in the ways intended. So in terms of awareness and control, we're not only dealing with somebody's ability to produce, we're also dealing with a listener or an interlocutor or a group of interlocutors' willingness to perceive as intended. And I would take this a little further. So if we're talking about awareness of sociolinguistic, we have a speaker who has control, some sort of control, implicit or explicit, but we also have to have listeners who are willing and able to interpret socially linked language use. And speaker and listener intentions, in order to be in sync, have to line up. But I think instead of saying must, maybe we should move towards they may line up. The speaker's intentions may line up with the listener's interpretations, or they may not. We may have different interpretations coming up. And so the role of interaction is key to the study of awareness and control, because listeners' expectations guide to some extent what they consider possible to hear. And these expectations don't come from nowhere. They're not kind of born in your brain. The expectations represent the residue of previous interactions or experiences. And this is a place where, in particular, sociophonetic research has done a lot of work on how those are closely integrated with the phonetic system. And again, because speakers' intentions may or may not align with listeners' expectations, the product of these intentions is emergent and interactional. It shifts and it is subjective. So these are kind of the things that I've been interested in lately in terms of awareness and control. Dialogical approaches to awareness, drawing on the edited volume by Tedlock and Mannheim, dialogical approaches to culture, links between perception and production, what it means to be willing to engage or to share the communicative burden in Libby Green's terms, and how much latitude of interpretation certain types of signs have, how much play. So Sherry Ortner, an anthropological theorist, talks about serious play, language and culture being a process of negotiation that is serious play. Okay, so I'm gonna hop off my soapbox for just a minute and get back to the studies that I promised you. So we will be starting with levels of awareness. And this work was published last year in Language and Society. That shouldn't say in press because it's already published. And we also published another version, or are in the process of publishing another version of it in Spanish. So I do my work in Bolivia. As you can see in this map of Bolivia, we have a highland portion towards the towards the south and west side of the country. And then a lowland portion of the country, which is in the northern and eastern sections. And this is a highly salient geographical division. It is also highly salient socially and linguistically. And I do my research kind of right in the middle of the country on the line between highland and lowland. I can't seem to find my cursor, but you can see Cochabamba, Santa Cruz, and Sucre are the three major cities in the center of the country. And my research is right in the middle of that little triangle formed by those three cities. So right between the orangish and the yellowish colors on this map representing highland and lowland. And so the relevant social, the very relevant social categories in this area include a group of people who are called Collas, Quechua dominant bilinguals from the Western Highlands, Gambas, Spanish monolinguals from the Eastern Lowlands. Local people tend to refer to themselves as Bayunos. So they reside in this little area in the Andean Intermontane valleys. People are generally Spanish dominant, but have a lot of contact with Quechua. And there is a continuous process of migration from Quechua dominant Western Highlands through the valleys to Spanish dominant Eastern Lowlands. So there's a continuous situation of language contact and also a continuous situation of language shift from Quechua towards Spanish. For those of you who may not be familiar with Quechua, it is an indigenous language spoken by 3 to 5 million people across the Andes. And Bolivia is one of the countries in which we have very large numbers of speakers of Quechua, many of them bilingual. One of the salient differences between Quechua and Spanish is the vowel systems. So Spanish has a 5-vowel system. Quechua has 3 vowels with 2, maybe 3 allophones, depending on the phonological context. So when Quechua dominant speakers speak Spanish, their Spanish vowels tend to be a little bit more centralized, and Spanish speakers often perceive Quechua dominant speakers' vowels as being kind of in between an e and an I, or in between an o and an u on the other side. This is a sociolinguistic stereotype. It's something that people often find quite easy to talk about, and it is one of the kind of signs of being a Quechua dominant speaker is having a slightly different vowel system in Spanish. So for this study, Kevin McGowan and I used experimental and interview methods to investigate the response of listeners to variation in words with e, I, and o, u, minimal pairs. Participants were told that they would hear a Quechua speaker from Cochabamba in the first experimental condition, followed by, same participant, a Spanish speaker from Santa Cruz in the second experimental condition, or vice versa. We mixed it up just to make sure everything was kosher. And they heard the same voice, right? So it was the same voice with a different pair of words for both of the different conditions. So the question is, when we tell someone they're listening to a Quechua speaker, does that shift the way that their vowels are perceived? And we found different results between the first and the second experimental condition, as well as differences in the experiment versus the interview responses. So our hypotheses were that manipulating the expectation of speaker identity would alter the listener category boundaries for E and OU. And specifically, creating an expectation of Quechua dominant speech would broaden listener vowel categories, resulting in more gradient and less categorical discrimination. So the way this worked, people saw this screen on my computer, and I would say, tell them if the middle word sounds more like the first one or the last one. And they would hear a file that sounded like this.
Muda, muda, muda.
Hopefully that came through for you guys. So they would have to say, oh, the middle one sounds more like the first one, or the middle one sounds more like the second one. Here's another example of the stimuli.
Pesa, pisa, pisa.
And then we saw, when did the listener's perception line up with what we expected experimentally? But in most cases, they were actually listening to kind of a vowel that's in between E, and O. This happened in mostly at my house in Bolivia. You can see here, this is about 10 years ago. So I was younger, my daughter was younger, the guy I'm talking to was younger. It was usually me and whoever was taking the experiment. Sometimes there were other people, children, partners, spouses, dogs present. But the person who was doing the experiment was the only one wearing earphones and the only one who could hear the stimuli. So there were 4 different groups. We had 2 groups of people who heard Quechua first, who were told they would hear a Quechua speaker first and told they would hear a Spanish speaker second. Another 2 groups that switched that order. And then we had 4 different vowel continua with soda suda, pisa pesa, mola muda, and pica peca, and we mixed those up as well. So if all the gray is too much and you're more of a color person, we had it in all the different orders, and we mixed those up randomly across our participants. We had about 20 participants, so not a huge number, but enough to get some results. So what we found is that when the listener was told to expect to hear a Spanish dominant speaker from Santa Cruz in the first block, their responses indicated that they held a clearer distinction between the vowel pairs. When they were told to expect to hear a Quechua dominant speaker from Cochabamba in the first block, their responses indicated a less clear distinction between the vowel pairs. And this is what we hoped and expected to find, because this is what has been found in mostly English-speaking situations in other studies. So the initial presentation here, we have speaker guys, Quechua guys on the left, Spanish guys on the right. And as you can see, for the Spanish guys, we have kind of an arch, which indicates a clear phonemic distinction between the 2 endpoints on the vowel continuum. For the Quechua condition, we have this very flat form, which shows that people are really not making a very clear distinction. Again, the recordings were the same speaker and the same variation. So the only difference here is what the listener thought they were hearing. So this is a great result. This is, we're very happy with this result. But this didn't transfer to the second block. So it seemed to be that people's listening strategies were set by their responses to the first block. So when we told the person, now you're going to hear somebody different, this person is a Spanish speaker from Santa Cruz, as opposed to the Quechua speaker from Cochabamba that you heard in the first block, the way they responded to the experiment did not change. So here you can see that people who heard Quechua second, that is, they heard Spanish first, Quechua second, continued to have a fairly clear distinction between vowel pairs, while people who heard Spanish second continued to have a fairly blurry distinction between vowel pairs, as they did for the Quechua guys in the first block. So that's cool. Then when we looked at the interview results, we found a very strong tendency for people to say that they heard a difference between the Spanish guys and the Quechua guys. And furthermore, people were more likely to say that the Spanish guys was educated than the Quechua guys. So this is clearly drawing on stereotypes about who is educated and what kind of person is a legitimate Spanish speaker. So about the Quechua speaker, consultant said, I don't know, I saw her as a person who has studied through 4th grade or so. I should say the Quechua guys because it was the same speaker. About the Spanish guys, this is the same consultant. I think she has studied because she speaks clearly. Another person said, the Spanish guys let you understand what she said better, and the Quechua guys, very little. And we have lots and lots of comments of this sort. So very interesting. The interview responses demonstrated that more than half of the consultants heard a difference between the two guises and were able to comment on it at an explicit level. And these discussions of difference between Spanish dominant and Quechua dominant guises revealed the influence of cultural stereotypes regarding the type of speaker who was likely to be educated and the ways that this education was framed by participants. And this wasn't just me. This was also verified by a research assistant who went through and did a qualitative analysis of the interview responses. So to sum up, the qualitative measures of sociolinguistic awareness that we obtained through interviews and in conversation were different than experimental measures of sociolinguistic awareness that we obtained through a perception task. So this shows us that social information is assimilated and processed at different levels of awareness. And furthermore, that what people perceive isn't necessarily what they believe they hear. So the relatively automatic responses are different than the interview responses. And I'm going to pull in somebody else's voice here in the spirit of dialogicity. Annette D'Onofrio has worked on very similar types of research, and she says that an early automatic response to a socially meaningful linguistic stimulus may be shifted, attenuated, or perhaps elaborated after a listener has more time with which to process the stimulus and more ability to control their responses. And crucially, this shift does not require metalinguistic knowledge of the sociolinguistic feature being perceived. So that was the first study, levels of awareness. At this point, take a deep breath, move on to the next study. Our unconscious biases or understanding of patterns in the world can insert, skew, or change bits of information to make them congruent with the way we think the world should work. And this study was published in the Journal of Sociolinguistics. The title is Stereotypes versus Experience. So again, same social context, different map. Again, we have the western side of Bolivia here identified with a colonial identification, Alto Peru. This is referring to the colonial administrative centers, which would have grouped highland Bolivia with Peru and lowland Bolivia with Argentina and Paraguay. Again, Collas are Quechua dominant bilinguals from the Western Highlands, Cambas, Spanish monolinguals from the Eastern Lowlands, and then people from my field site, which is called Saipina. Local people consider themselves Vayunos and inhabit this happy medium between Spanish and Quechua, but are generally Spanish dominant. And in this study, I was looking specifically at pues. So pues is a Spanish discourse marker. It's used differently in different dialects of Spanish, but in Andean Spanish, it organizes topics, it marks segments of discourse, and it's virtually always clause final. It can be pronounced without the vowel, without the final consonant, or without either the vowel or the final consonant. We'll hear some beautiful examples of this in a moment. Pues in particular is highly metapragmatically salient. People talk about the pronunciation of this word a lot, so it's kind of a shibboleth. In the words of one of my consultants, los Collas hablan silbando. Collas whistle when they talk, saying pss, pss, pss. So when I carried out interviews with people, and this has been consistent for the 20 years that I have worked in my field site, people explicitly associate the consonant maintenance and pues with Highlanders. That is, people from Western towns and cities that are identified in this work as Potosí Oruro, Carapari, and Cochabamba. And people explicitly associated the vowel deletion and lenition, the consonant deletion and lenition, pue and pue, with lowlanders, that is people from Eastern towns and cities identified here as Iscamayo, which is the pseudonym that I use for Saipina, the Santa Cruz Valleys, and the city of Santa Cruz. There are a number of stereotypes that are associated with Collas versus Cambas. One of the common sayings that I often heard was this epithet, Camba flojo, lazy Camba, versus Colla burro, donkey of a Colla. So donkey there indexing stubborn and not too bright. Collas, that is people from Cochabamba in this case, are stereotyped as Quechua speaking, indigenous. For those of you familiar with Bolivian politics, MAS and Evo Morales supporters, hardworking, but also decisive, determined, ambitious. This also edges into pushy and mean. So kind of a constellation of different ideas associated with Collas. While Cambas from Santa Cruz are stereotyped as being lazy, disorganized, and living only for the day. So I'm going to walk you through one consultant's use of pues and pue. And we're going to start with her typical use, which is consonant lenition. And I do have a recording here with a transcription for those of you who may not be able to follow the Spanish. You'll see that she's got 3 examples of pues in this short excerpt, and all of them have the consonant lenition and deletion.
Casi no querías estar aquí, me vinieron a pedir, digamos, la comunidad, cuántos de aquí de la comunidad me pidieron. Ya, yo acepté estar en la lista. Pasó un tiempo y ya me dijeron, pues no hay más opción, que tienen que entrar. Yo no quería, casi no me animaba porque no sé.
So you can hear here Marina's typical use of pues, which has the consonant lenition. She is a Spanish dominant speaker with extensive contact with Quechua. She knows and uses a lot of Quechua loanwords, but doesn't use the language actively herself, and she identifies as a Valley person. Here in a segment where she's referring to Koyas and actually referring to them in a very positive sense, we've got another 3 examples of pues. 2 of them have her typical consonant lenition, but in one of them, when she's talking directly about Koyas, she actually uses the S, and I think this is socially meaningful in terms of indexing a positive stance towards Koyas.
Porque los cambas tienen cabalito para el día, tienen que tener. Y mientras los collas, pues ellos les gusta trabajar y ahorrarse y tener algo, pues, ¿no? Trabajar. Y los cambas, pues no tengan nada, tan siguen felices.
And I think there's also some morphosyntactic stuff going on here with están siguen felices, which is also a Western linked construction. So she's very firmly linking herself with a positive attitude towards Koyas in this little excerpt. And I should say that all of this analysis was carried out not only by me, but also with another research assistant who went through and looked at these examples closely, listened to them with earphones at high volumes over and over, probably traumatized him, and then also took a look at the spectrograms in Prot. So even if it's not quite clear over the internet connection, I promise you it's right. And we've also got many other examples apart from the ones that I'm showing you today. Finally, we've got an assertive stance taking. So as I was saying, Koyas are often associated with this kind of pushy attitude. And so Marina is speaking to her daughter. You'll hear her daughter whining. And in the last example, which you will not be able to hear over the internet, she uses this pues as an assertive marker, which is kind of cool. So here we've got kind of an orders of indexicality thing going on with the S in pues.
Muy abajo, pues no veo. Tu cabeza.
Okay, so as you can see from both the interviews, the explicit and also the implicit ways that people use the S, maintenance or lenition, we have these very strong language ideologies that group Highlanders, Koyas, with maintenance of the consonant. So this would be Potosí, Oruro, Carapari, and especially Cochabamba, and groups lowlanders with consonant lenition and deletion. So this would be Iscamayo and the valleys. But when we took a look at a corpus of speech from this area, what we found is that it's true that Potosí, Oruro, and Carapari grouped together in terms of consonant maintenance. But in fact, people from Cochabamba tended to use consonant deletion in many of the same ways that Iscamayo and people from the valleys did. So even though people thought and very strongly related Cochabamba with consonant maintenance, in actual production, people from Cochabamba were very similar to people from the valleys and from the lowlands. So, we did, when I say we, I mean, Kevin McGowan again helped me out with this. We ran an unsupervised cluster analysis, which confirmed these statistical findings, where you can see that the strongest groupings for consonant deletion include not only Bayuno and Iscamayo, but also Cochabamba. And then we have a grouping for vowel deletion only. The ways in which people use this, Cochabamba and Bayuno are quite similar to each other. So this is totally in contrast to what people said explicitly and the way that they used it in their speech. So Despite explicit and implicit ideologies linking vowel deletion in pues with Cochabamba and consonant deletion with Santa Cruz, statistical analysis revealed that in the corpus that I collected, people from the two regions actually use very similar phonetic realizations of pues. So the stereotypical representations of this lexical item, in some sense, in the metalinguistic commentary, override the evidence from data in this corpus. Now, we are making an assumption here, right? So the assumption is that this corpus is representative of language users' experience. It may be that people travel consistently to Cochabamba, and in Cochabamba things are very different, and it's just the people from Cochabamba that live in the valleys that do this funny thing. But I do think it is interesting to see that despite the evidence that we find in the corpus that Cochabamba and the valleys are actually very similar in their pronunciation of this very salient discourse marker, people believe that they are very different, and indeed people believe that this is one of the strongly characteristic differences of speech between speech from these two regions. And again, I'm going to call in another voice here. So Katie Carmichael in her research has found that the awareness of a link between regional accents in certain places created sociolinguistic expectations that affected participants' evaluations of speakers in a listening task. When expectations about accentedness from a given place were unmet, participants' reactions to the stimuli reflected this mismatch. So participants made active use of their sociolinguistic awareness during a listening task. Pretty interesting results. So that was our second study. Our unconscious biases or understanding of patterns in the world can insert, skew, or change bits of information to make them congruent with the way that we think the world should work. At this point, I'm going to move on to the third study. And this is one that I believe shows that production is not always the best sign of control. This data actually goes quite far back. It's data that I collected for my dissertation, but there are certain pieces of data that I just kind of like to go back to over and over again and kind of hold them up like a prism in the light of different theories and see how they reflect and refract those theories. So this was my contribution to the awareness and control volume, and you can find it there. So the question here is, what does it mean to control a set of linguistic features in production? And what kinds of messages does an apparent lack of control send? So how do we interpret performances when they don't conform to our expectations for appropriateness to context? So what I was looking at was the way that people changed the way they spoke between more formal contexts, such as community meetings, and less formal contexts, such as relaxed conversation. And what I found in quite a large corpus was a distinction between morphosyntactic variables, which were apparently less salient. People found them a little harder to control. Individuals often found them harder to control. And phonetic and phonological variables, which were apparently more salient, and people used them very intentionally. So I kind of tested this broader data set with data from two consultants who I was very close to and for whom I had a lot of data. And both of them happened to be older women who were firmly oriented towards a traditional value system. And when I say traditional value system, I mean one in which a person's value is determined by their hardworkingness, by their generosity, by the way that they are integrated into a community, rather than a so-called modern value system where people's worth may be evaluated based on how much money they have or how much education they hold. And it was people who were highly educated, tended to be male, and tended to be fairly wealthy, who were most comfortable taking the floor in formal types of situations. So these two women in general resisted being put into formal situations. And it was only because I was so close to them and I was able to twist some arms just a little bit that I was able to get this data. So in the broader corpus, I looked at a bunch of different morphosyntactic contact features. So as I said, the morphosyntactic ones tended to be a little bit lower awareness. And what you see in this graph here is that the further to the left they are, the more likely it is that they are occurring in informal contexts. The further to the right, the more likely that they're occurring in formal contexts. So everything that is above the x-axis is more likely to occur in an informal context. Everything that is below the x-axis is more likely to occur in an in a formal context. And I'm just going to take a couple little clips from each of these speakers so you can hear what they sound like in the more formal versus in the less formal setting. And I'm going to start with a woman whose pseudonym is Prima. And here she is in the more formal setting where I'm carrying out a language ideologies interview with her and her husband. We're sitting across from each other at a table. I'm holding a list of questions. And she's telling me about how much she wishes that her children would have studied English. And in bold here are some of the features that are marking a more formal style of discourse.
En cambio, yo harto y deseado que mi hija antes entre a estudiar inglés. También Elena y así como que allá sí hay no ve para llevar puro inglés, no ve. Ay, pues para salir de profesora de inglés, ¿no ve?
Sí, sí, sí.
Y ellos no han tenido interés. Igual él ha hecho 2-3 meses para ese inglés. Y de ahí la ha dejado también porque ella también no podía alcanzarse.
Okay, so and I should say that this woman is also a Spanish dominant speaker. She does have a lot of contact with Quechua, but it does not herself identify as a Quechua speaker. So here's a little extract from the informal context where I'm talking to her about a kitchen stove that she was using, and she's giving me some advice about how it might work better. So one thing you notice in the first transcript is that she's actually using usted with me. So in addition to all of the morphosyntactic markers, she didn't usually use usted with me. I was a much younger person. In this one, she's using her more typical vos, so a very informal style with me. And you'll see also lots of diminutives that are marking a less formal style of speech.
Yo decía, Anita, ¿sabéis qué decía? Que si no hubiera tenido el ladrillo, fuera solamente el fierro, eso más bien quería yo no decir. Que tenga solamente ese fierro y tenga las patitas, que no tenga el ladrillo para que tenga más campito adentro. Sí, así es el campito. Entre más campito, más ponemos leñita y más bracea, más cálida.
All right, so again, this is kind of our little scale of less formal to more formal. And when we take a look at the way that Prima uses these contact features, we would expect the less formal context to be showing up more on the left and the more formal context to be showing up more on the right. You can see that this is indeed what we find for Prima. So she does, in the longer discourse analysis that I carried out, she does seem to conform to these morphosyntactic expectations for more formal types of speech, even though she did resist being put into that kind of context. The second speaker is Juana, again, another older woman. She is also Spanish dominant, also has a lot of contact with Quechua. And here, she's in a meeting where we're talking again about these little cooking stoves. And I've asked her to speak about her experience using the stoves. But in the moment, I finished saying what I was going to say, and then I kind of turned to her and waited for her to say something, and she froze. There was a 10-second pause, which you'll hear on the recording, during which you can literally hear crickets chirping before she started in, and she clearly did not feel very comfortable in this context. As the discussion goes on, you'll see that an audience member starts giving her this positive minimal feedback, and she starts to transfer into more of a testimonial style.
Bueno, de las cocinas a leña yo veo que muy económicas son. O sea, uno se trae su leña y si quiere hacer las cosas rápido, y bueno, el cosito es pequeño, ¿ves? Para meterle leña. Y uno agarra, le pone un pedacito así pequeño también por arriba. Y eso arde como si estuviera apurándote con así tronco, arde bien. Y así hacer comida rápida.
And these things in bold are actually, most of them are not formal linked. También is, but the other three are less formal types of morphosyntactic structures. So here we have another little clip from Juana in an informal context where she is chatting with a friend of her mother's. And she's talking about her mother's recent illness. And you can see she's using, again, a lot of diminutives. The no más and the pues are also very informal types of morphosyntax. And I want to warn you Warning, this is very noisy. There is a truck passing by at the beginning of the clip, so you may want to hold your earphones away from your head or turn down your volume for just a second as the clip begins.
Su bracito bien delgadito, huesito nomás. Yo me tenía preocupada. Pedía auxilio a los hermanos, ninguno. Hasta que vino una su comadre. Vamos allá, le dije, allá se va, hay un doctor bueno, le dije. Vamos, le dije, no fuimos. Lo hemos ido y lo hemos llevado ese día, esa noche al doctor. Yo no podía ni dormir por la noche.
So again, here we have our graph showing what we expect from the morphosyntactic contact features, starting with the less formal and going towards the more formal. What we see from Juana is actually different from what we see from Prima. So in Juana's case, there's not a whole lot of difference between the more formal and the less formal features between the conversation and the meeting, and it's very inconsistent which one is where. So this is not a statistical analysis, but this is just kind of a visual way of representing what I saw in the discourse analysis. It is, however, quantitatively accurate. I'm not going to go in detail through the high awareness features because they tend to be extremely less common, so there's not as many of them. But just when you glance at these two graphics, you can see that Juana tends to use loanwords. Prima tends to use a lot more of the phonological features. And even though Prima has a fairly expected distribution of morphosyntactic features, that's not true for her phonetic and phonological performance. So what we can see from the data is that Prima conforms more closely to general patterns of usage of morphosyntactic features in formal contexts than Juana. Juana uses fewer phonetic features or loanwords in both formal and informal contexts than does Prima. So both of these women have a form of control, but they have different forms of control. And this is something that I've gone over and over and over again in terms of how to interpret. So the question is, when people do not use a set of features as expected, can we take this as evidence that they do not control them? So both Juana and Prima were aware of the conventions of the oratorical genre. Both of them resisted being put into situations in which they were required to use an oratorical style or a formal style. Prima seemed to be quote unquote better at controlling the morphosyntactic features, while Juana seemed to be quote unquote better at controlling phonetic phonological features. But what I would argue is that this does not demonstrate a lack of control, but rather that these women were using this as part of a conspicuous orientation towards a traditional value system in which their lives and their abilities were better valued as members of a very tight-knit community, as women who were known to be generous and hardworking, and not so much in a value system in which higher education and a control of this oratory genre would be validated as the ways in which people are made to matter. So I would like, again, to draw in another voice here, and this comes from an article, an older article by John Rickford, who was kind of the godfather of the awareness and control volume, in which he's arguing for using many types of data to evaluate speakers' abilities. And he says that sociolinguistics can't make further progress until we overcome ideological barriers against the use of intuitions and begin involving speakers as active partners and participants rather than as passive objects of observation and analysis. So we need intuitions, we need observations, we need multiple recordings of people in different contexts, and also explicit elicitation exercises, which is what Rickford does in this article, in order to truly understand what people are capable of and why they do what they do. So I think this is a really, really important point, and it underlines the importance of agency, of our speakers' agency in the way that they use language. So the main point here was that there are levels or modes of awareness. Oh, I'm sorry. The main point here was that production is not always the best sign of control, or perhaps rather that there are different types of control. So those were the 3 studies that I wanted to share with you. And at this point, I hope everybody is still awake and has their coffee in hand, because I'm going to invite you to jump with me off the deep end and start thinking of this a little bit on the more theoretical side. So we started out by asking, where does social meaning reside? And we talked about a social meaning as being dialogically constructed between speakers and listeners, and not just a speaker listener in one head, but a communicative situation in which we have multiple participants and people interacting. And I'm going to slide this question a little bit towards how do we theorize this question of where social meaning resides. So I know what your Saturday morning was missing was a little bit of semiotics. So we're going to jump right in to sign, signifier, and signified. So in Saussure's course de linguistics, I forget what it's called in French, not a French speaker, unfortunately, or not a very good French speaker anyway. He says that a sign consists not just of reference, but of a relationship between signifier and signified. So the sound image actually draws into being a concept, and the concept is identified by the sound image. And I think that this tends to be the semiotic basis on which a lot of sociolinguistic research is based. I am going to argue that we may actually want to think about this in a slightly different way. And so I'm going to bring in not only signifier and signified, but also the interpretant, drawing on Peircean semiotics, which tends to be what linguistic anthropologists use when they talk about signs. What is an interpretant? So Peirce says that a sign is something which stands to somebody for something. Right? So we've got our signifier and our signified, but we've also got a mental representation of the sign. So it addresses somebody. It creates in the mind of the person an equivalent sign, or perhaps a more developed sign, which is the interpretant of the first sign. So here we have a three-part relationship between an object, a sign, and an interpretant. And Peirce says that the determination does not just flow from object to sign, but from the object through the sign to a further action or mental representation. So we're talking about mental representations that mediate the way that we perceive signs. And in this, so this is a graph from an article by Paul Kockelman. It is actually not perfect because I think the arrows go in the wrong direction, but basically you've got this tripartite relationship between object, interpretant, and sign. And one of the points that Kockelman, among other scholars, makes is that we can actually have multiple, in fact, simultaneous or perhaps overlapping interpretants. The interpretant is the translation, explanation, or conceptualization of the sign-object relationship in a subsequent sign representing the same object. So signs that are highly determined offer little latitude of interpretation. And here we're coming back to this idea of play for the translating sign. So we can have signs that don't have a lot of latitude of interpretation, where the interpretant tends to be fairly closely defined, but we can also have signs where there's a lot of play and where we can have a lot of different possible interpretants. So as we're thinking about this, we can use the interpretant to understand some of the data that I've been presenting today. We can think of interpretants as being able to be shifted at a perceptual level, as in the perceptual data from perceiving isn't believing. We can think of interpretants as being able to be overruled by our explicit perceptions, as in the interview data from perceiving isn't believing, and also the second study, Stereotypes versus Experience. We can infer an interpretant from social expectations or norms, as in the last study, Silence as Control. And finally, an apparent lack of control may also represent refusal to adapt to hegemonic norms, as we see in Silence as Control. You might also look at Leboeuf's case study of Nathan B., someone who does not use formal variance as expected, but who explicitly positions this as a choice and as an identity marker, despite the real and material consequences it has for him as a professional. So at this point, I come to, why does all this matter? Who cares? And the reason we care is because these signs hold material power. Social discrimination, including racial and ethnic discrimination, is written into our cognitive, mental, social processes. And our experiences in interaction, the residue of our previous interactions and through dialogical constructions of meaning, produce the opportunity to wiggle or play with our interpretation of a linguistic sign. And this is where all of our social and perceptual biases kind of rush in the door. So this is a topic that I kind of tried to grapple with in a TED talk that I did recently. But I'm going to jump into it a little bit more from a research perspective, just briefly before we conclude. So it's been widely observed in the US that Latino or Hispanic children are placed in ESL classes regardless of their English language performance. Just as in the Bolivian examples that I discussed in the body of the talk, people's perception of language usage is shaped not only by what they hear, but also what they expect to hear. And I had the dubious privilege of seeing this in action when my own two English-dominant Latino children were each separately placed in English as a second language classes in the public school they attended. And when I say English as a second language, I mean that assumes that English is not their first language, erroneously. So when this happened to my son, I asked for an explanation from the teacher, and she explained why my son, who actually strongly prefers English and has spoken English since he began to speak, didn't score as an advanced level speaker of English. So the examples that she shared with me include, and I should say that the child at this point was a preschooler who was 4 years old. When he retold stories that had previously been told to him, he wasn't able to sequence the stories with words such as first, next, or then. He struggled to repeat the pronunciation of apostrophe S as a possessive. For example, when he was asked to repeat the sentence, "Who has Jane's pencil?" his response was, "Who has Jane pencil?" This is a common mistake made by an ESL student whose native language does not include a similar structure for possessives. As I say in the TED Talk, this is also a common structure in a non-standard dialect of English, African-American English, in which it is a perfectly grammatical construction. And finally, he made a handful of mistakes on the writing section, for example, spelling up as op and spelling is as. I saw this and I was like, oh my God, my child can spell. I had no idea he could get that close to up and is at the age of 4. And she went on to say, as you can imagine, even native English-speaking students with no exposure to other languages might still not score advanced level status, simply depending on what they've retained and how much literacy support is happening at home. The fact that he's been assessed and entered into our system as an ESL student is a huge asset in ensuring that he doesn't, quote, fall between the cracks of the education system. So what do we see in these discourses? It is definitely a racialized interpretation of language. And I think here we can see the construction of the ideal home and ideal parenting as monolingual. And contrary-wise, ideal language learning is occurring in institutional settings. An interesting detail here is that the school is actually a French immersion school. So every child in the school is exposed to a language other than English in an institutional setting. And we see here that children of color are racialized, and bi and multilingual homes are treated as inherently problematic through this discourse of slipping through the cracks. So what we see here is that the teacher takes a set of signs, which she explained to me, and she establishes a link to a category or label, limited English proficient. And her justification for this label draws on a set or a pattern of signs that range from literacy practices to attentiveness to phonetics to styles of speech. And what I would argue here is that this racialization of language and of speaking subjects lies less in the speaker-listener's intention, because I do think this teacher had good intentions, than in the play between levels of awareness and the ways that we fill in bits of language based on expected sociolinguistic patterns. That is, we see a Latino child in front of us who's being tested to see whether their English is good enough. And perhaps we expect that the child will not be a proficient speaker of English, despite the fact that we know that even English-speaking children might not perform to the level of advanced on this task. So before we get too far off, kind of into the land of off the deep end, I do want to return to our main ideas, which is that there are levels of awareness that diverge at the conscious and unconscious level, and we can hold multiple approximately simultaneous impressions of a particular sign. Our unconscious biases or understandings of patterns in the world can insert, skew, or change bits of information to make them congruent with the way we think the world should work. And finally, production is not always the best sign of control, or we can think of control as well as awareness as occurring at multiple levels. And finally, I would argue that these facts have material consequences for people who live in systems of racial and linguistic inequality. I've given you one example from my own life. Another great academic example comes from Rickford and King in their analysis of Rachel Jeantel's testimony in the Trayvon Martin case. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for being with me this morning and for indulging me as I went through all of these studies. I would love to hear comments or questions now. I would love to hear them later if you don't have a chance to throw them out now. Thanks to everybody who has contributed to the research and to this talk, including and especially my consultants. And I will open the floor for questions at this point.
Thank you very much, Anna. We will go ahead and begin the question and answer session of this presentation. I encourage you all to put your questions into the chat, and I'll give everyone a minute or two to go ahead and upload those. In the meantime, I wondered, Anna, if you might comment a little bit more about this research on awareness and control and some of the major gaps maybe that still exist within this research moving forward that you hope to see others working towards.
That's a great question. I think there's so much still to do. All of the things that I've pointed out today are starting points for more research. So as I said at the beginning of the talk, we talk about levels of awareness, but we don't really know whether levels is what we should be discussing, and whether in fact we should be talking about dimensions of awareness, or whether we should be talking about different cognitive systems that interact with awareness. So I think there is a great deal more to do. It's also really important to be doing this research outside of English-speaking contexts, because the great majority of the work that has been done in this area has been in basically college students in English-speaking regions of the world. So I think indigenous language speakers, multilingual situations are really, really important to follow up on. As I was mentioning at the end, we talk about control is less talked about, right? So control is less talked about in general than awareness. And I think that there is good evidence for differing levels or dimensions of control that we really, really need to look at. I have been super excited about migration for a long time. So I have been looking at data from people who migrate as adults, whether young adults or older adults, to different dialect regions. And I think that those are true kind of moments of rupture at which people become aware that the way that they personally speak may sound funny or different to people from another region. So that area is also wide open. Yeah, I think there's a lot to do. The other one that I wanted to bring out was the link between production and perception, because I think that is also not well understood. And this is a place where awareness, so studying awareness and control requires us to link perception and production in a way that other fields of linguistics maybe haven't demanded. So I think this is a contribution that awareness and control has to contribute to the rest of linguistics.
All right, I'd like to turn to a question that appeared here in the chat. What is your opinion of the role of frequency in awareness studies? Can the fine grain of certain variables influence its low or higher awareness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think frequency is very important, but frequency has to interact with something that brings a variable to the level of awareness. So you could see this going both ways, right? You can see something very frequent as being something very salient. You could also see something very frequent as being something less salient because it happens so much people don't notice it. So one thing that we might think about is the fact that very frequent words tend to have more lenition or to be more reduced. And so there may be kind of some space for variation there that might not happen as much with less frequent words. I think it is interesting that discourse markers tend to be something that people focus on so much. And we know that discourse markers are often very, very frequent. So I think there is a relationship there, and that would definitely be something to look at. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Devin.
It is a fascinating question. I think I hope to see obviously more research in the future that looks at exactly what you're talking about. Here in the chat, there's another series of questions here, just contrasting this idea of levels of awareness with, I think, what we often think of as awareness being a binary condition, whether you're aware or you're not aware, right? And you've given us different empirical examples already of these manifestations, but I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit more about these kind of levels and the way in which they really challenge kind of the binary way that we think about awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it's binary at all, right? So that was probably one of my inspirations for doing this and on working on this, is that when we say people are aware or people are aware or not aware, a lot of times we're talking about they can discuss it explicitly, right? So, and there's a huge role for individual variation there, right? Some people are very, very linguistically aware. Some people are not, right? Some people are great mimics and can perform things that they can't talk about explicitly. Some people can discuss other people's speech, but aren't so aware of their own. And so when I look at the literature, I see a lot of different ways of approaching awareness. Definitely from the linguistic anthropology side, you see a lot more of the explicit commentary, the metalinguistic and metapragmatic comments. When we look at the research from sociophonetics, what we see are experimental approaches that are dealing with the way that people hear sounds and how that is influenced by social categories. And I think generally we've tended to see that as something that is less aware. Less conscious types of aware. That makes no sense at all. It's something that's less controlled, right? Something that's a little bit faster. And one thing I've talked about in the past is the way that levels of awareness might be connected to time sequence, right? So we often talk about kind of rapid responses as in contrast to controlled responses. I think that's actually another really great direction to go with this, is to do some kind of time course, possibly with eye tracking or something like that, to see how people's perception might change over the first few seconds, or even looking back after some time on something that they heard. So yeah, it's absolutely not the case that it's either you're aware or you're not. I think it's people have different ways of grappling with and expressing their awareness of sociolinguistic features.
We have another question here, which is specifically about silence in relation to control, which of course is one of the main topics in the last study that you spoke to us about. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about silence and its relation to control and the importance of silence within sociolinguistics more generally.
Yeah, so one thing I found out when I wrote this chapter is that there's actually quite a wide literature on silence, starting with, well, I don't even know where it starts. There's quite a lot of really good literature. One of the ones that I really enjoy is Learning How to Ask, which is really more of a methods book. And thinking about the role of the interviewer and the ways that people might resist answering questions because of the role that they see themselves to be in. So silence can definitely be a strategy for resistance. It can be a way of rejecting specific things that people say. It can be a way of rejecting whole value systems, as I argue that it is in the data that I present. I think silence is very, very important. So one of the, and I think it might have been Deborah Tannen, maybe, I forget. One of the articles that I read as I was writing this chapter talked about silence in music as being space between the notes. The notes make no sense unless you look at the silence in between them. And I think that's absolutely true of speech and of conversation as well. Silences are heavy with meaning. They are loaded with meaning, but we need our entire social system to be able to interpret that silence. And sometimes maybe we need to go back and ask people what they meant. So I think silence is a really great example of the cultural variability of kind of meaning, and also of the ways that people can have different understandings of it, right? So if someone is silent towards me, do I interpret that as being hostile? Do I interpret that as, a refusal to engage? Do I interpret it as a lack of ability, as I think we tend to do in sociolinguistics? That series of interpretations exists, right? Many things can exist at the same time, and they can exist at different levels. Do I interpret silence as, Devin's on Zoom and he knows that if he says something, it's going to interrupt the sound stream, right? I think we've all learned as we've been interacting with different modes of participation to use our silences in different ways as we interact with people. So that in itself is super interesting too.
All right, while we wait for perhaps another question or two, I wanted to return to what you were discussing about semiotics and the fact that within linguistics, we tend to learn about Saussure, right? And his theory of semiotics is really central to the larger enterprise of linguistics. But you also mentioned Peircean semiotics, which is something that we as linguists, usually are not trained in. It is more common within linguistic anthropology. So I wanted you to maybe discuss and maybe contrast a little bit more these different ways of thinking about the sign, and specifically how research, right, which is based in kind of one conceptualization of the linguistic sign, is in conversation with perhaps another approach, and what maybe some of the advantages or disadvantages are when it comes to comparing studies that are based on different ideas about the sign itself, specifically in relation to awareness and control.
Oh, that's a super complicated question. Very brave of you, Devin. Yeah. So I think, and I hope it was clear from the way that I talked about it, I really think that the interpretant is key to understanding awareness and control, because we're talking about, and this comes from lots of research, not just my research, right? But it's clear that we form mental representations that are linked to social categories, right? And it's clear that we use our social systems in order to interpret the linguistic signal, right? And so that has to happen. And the place where I get a little bit stuck is that I do think it happens in dialogue, right? But I don't think it's always a literal dialogue between two people, right? Like I think sometimes the dialogicity is, in the Bakhtinian sense, kind of an echo of previous interactions or of previous conversations or experiences that we hold as part of our linguistic capacity. And that dialogical representation informs the way that we understand language. And that is where our interpretant or interpretants come from. And the interpretant is the representation itself in our mind. And I think as some of the quotes that I was talking about earlier show, that interpretant can give rise to other interpretants. It's never just one, it's kind of a hall of mirrors effect. And I also think this is very, very closely linked to orders of indexicality, to Silverstein. And I think that this is one way to push our understanding of awareness and control further, and also to link the experimental sociophonetic kinds of studies to the linguistic anthropological theory in a way that's productive for both. So I think that the Saussurean sign is really cool and interesting in the way that it emphasizes that there is no previously existing object, right? So the sign brings something into being that is a discrete, nameable thing, right? The name and the object, the sign, the signifier and the signified are part of one whole. But I do think that concept leaves something out when we're talking about people, right? And so Peirce doesn't necessarily mean people, right? Peirce says very explicitly that semiotics doesn't have to be in the mind of a person. But language, as we generally study it, is happening in interaction between people, right? And so I think that as human beings do, we are always drawing on our social systems, and we have to be able to account for that within the theory of semiotics that we use.
All right, I don't see any other questions appearing here in the chat. So I believe we can go ahead and move towards the conclusion of this session. Once again, like to thank you very much on behalf of Abraling, and invite everyone who's watching to continue watching this series. And I wondered, Anna, if you would perhaps conclude this transmission with some final remarks.
All I have to say is thank you so much to everybody who's here and watching. I want to underline once more that this has been an incredibly difficult year. And just the fact of being able to connect with other people who are thinking about language thoughts makes me very happy. And I hope that there's some happiness to be found for you also in this talk. So thank you, Devin. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Abraling.
Thank you.